In a forgotten quarter of a small coastal town, beyond where the mist smothers the morning and the sea seems to sigh against the rocks, there stood an old brick building with blackened windows and a clock tower that had long stopped ticking. No one remembered when the library was built. It had no name, only a rusted sign that read "Closed until further notice," nailed crookedly across the double oak doors. But the library was never truly closed. Locals knew better than to speak of it, but some said if you knocked 3 times after midnight, once for the past, once for the present, and once for the future, the doors would creak open, and if you dared enter, you'd find a single desk lamp glowing in the darkness, and behind it, a man in a charcoal robe with white gloves and eyes too pale to be human. He never introduced himself. He didn't need to. They called him the librarian. He never asked what book you wanted. He already knew. Before you uttered a word, he would vanish into the maze of shelves and return with a single leather-bound tome, bound with something that looked like stitched skin and fastened with a clasp that felt warm to the touch. The book always had your name on the spine, and when you opened it, you would find the last few pages blank, except for one, a page titled "The Date of Your Death," written in delicate, handwritten ink. Not estimated, not guessed, known, fixed. Some laughed and dismissed it as urban legend. Others claimed it was real, and that their uncle or sister or teacher once stepped through those rotting doors and came back pale, silent, and never the same. They'd lock their calendars, refused to drive, refused to sleep. But no matter what they did, the date always arrived. There was a girl once, named Meredith Crane, 16, curious, obsessed with ghost stories and forbidden places. On a dare, she went alone. She knocked. The doors opened, and in the flickering light, she saw the pale-eyed librarian waiting. He already had her book. She took it. She returned home laughing, bragging. Said it was a hoax. Said the date written in her book was nonsense. She showed it to her friends. August 2nd. Just 2 weeks away. She tossed the book in the fireplace, filmed it for TikTok. Her likes exploded. So did the whispers. But the morning of August 2nd, she never came down for breakfast. Her parents found her in bed, eyes wide open. No wounds. No illness. Just gone. They say the librarian isn't interested in who you were, only who you'll be, for the last time. And once he writes your page, it cannot be unwritten. And still, on nights when the fog curls tight around the streets like a snake, the library breathes. The smell of old paper seeps from its cracks. Some say they've seen the pale light again. Some say they hear soft footsteps. And if you ever find your name missing from the town census, if strangers begin to look through you like you've already gone, that's when you'll know. The librarian already does. 3 weeks after Meredith Crane's quiet funeral, another name slipped through the whispers of the town, Julian Marrow. He wasn't the kind of boy who chased shadows or flirted with danger. Quiet, bookish, the kind of 17-year-old who wore headphones without music just to avoid conversation. But Julian had always been fascinated, no, haunted by silence. He would often say that silence was where the world told its most uncomfortable truths. And lately, the silence had been watching him. It began with the books. Every morning, a new volume appeared in his school locker. No name, no stamp, just a weathered spine and brittle pages that cracked like old bones. The first was obituaries of the forgotten. Then came maps of nowhere. The third simply read borrowed time. Each one made his fingers tingle when he opened it. But the fourth was different. He found it not in his locker, but on his pillow. His window was locked, the room undisturbed. Yet there it lay, thick, damp, and humming faintly. No title on the cover. But when he opened it, the first page read, Julian Marrow, archive hashtag 72391D. Currently alive. He dropped the book. It landed with a soft thump, but did not close. The pages began to turn on their own. Faster, faster, until they stopped somewhere in the middle. There, in tight cursive, was a sentence etched in ink darker than blood. Date confirmed. Witness required. Julian didn't sleep that night. The next day, he tried to tell someone, his mother, a teacher, even the police, but no words came out. His throat locked up like a sealed vault. Not from fear, but something more deliberate. Like a curse. His breath shivered. And then the dreams began. Each night, he saw the library, but not as the world saw it. In his dreams, it was colossal, endless, built from staircases that led into black voids and doorways that opened into storms of paper. The librarian waited at the center, seated beneath a chandelier of teeth. He never moved, but his eyes followed Julian as if they were stitched to his soul. Julian stopped going to school. His eyes sank into hollows. He began to write things he didn't remember learning. Names of people no one else knew, dates that hadn't yet arrived, and death certificates with blank spaces where signatures should be. He was becoming something else. One night, the dream changed. He was no longer in the library. He was becoming the library. His skin peeled into paper, his veins into ink, his voice into whispers that echoed forever. And standing before him, watching silently, was another version of himself, paler, taller, dressed in gray, wearing white gloves. When he woke up, the fifth book was waiting. This time, the cover wasn't blank. It read, Julian Marrow, Final Edition. Julian didn't open the book at first. He left it untouched on his desk, staring at it the way a man stares at a locked coffin, unsure whether it holds the dead, or something waiting to rise. But the book pulsed softly beneath the lamp light, like a second heartbeat in the room. Its cover seemed to breathe when no wind stirred. At exactly 3:03 a.m., the pages began flipping on their own again. This time, they stopped on a page etched with something new. The final edition must be returned. Deliver it to the archive before the breath runs dry. Beneath the message, an address had been handwritten in faded ink. Julian's skin turned cold. The address was not printed on any map. It wasn't a location that could be searched online or found on GPS. It was simply a direction. Turn left where the road ends. Walk where no footsteps follow. Enter when the shadow forgets you. He should have burned the book, tossed it into the river. But he couldn't. Something in his hands wouldn't obey his mind anymore. His fingers gripped the spine, like it was part of his body. When he blinked, he swore he felt his name written on every page inside, layered in invisible ink. On the third night, he followed the instructions. Julian waited until the fog was thick enough to mute the town. He wandered past the outskirts where streetlights ended, to where the road dissolved into gravel and then into silence. No birds, no crickets, no wind, just the absence of sound. Then he saw it, the library, no longer cracked and forgotten. Tonight, it stood tall and impossibly vast, with windows that flickered like candlelit eyes and walls that pulsed with ancient breath. The closed sign was gone. The double door stood ajar. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old ink, leather, and something faintly metallic, like blood dried on parchment. Julian stepped forward. As he did, the doors creaked closed behind him, and the world outside disappeared, like it had never been real at all. He stood in a vast chamber, where bookshelves stretched so high they vanished into darkness. Floating orbs of dim, yellow light drifted above him, illuminating only fragments of the endless aisles. And there he was, the librarian, seated at the same desk Julian had seen in dreams. Only now, up close, the librarian's face was even less human. Paper-thin skin wrapped around hollow cheekbones, eyes like milky opals, his gloved hands folded neatly atop an open ledger. "You've come to return it," the librarian said, though his lips never moved. Julian stepped closer, trembling. The book in his hands had grown colder, heavier. "I didn't ask for this," Julian whispered. "No one does," replied the librarian. "The archive does not seek permission. It seeks completion." "What happens if I give it back?" Julian asked. The librarian tilted his head, just slightly. "You vanish, but only where it matters." Julian looked down at his hands. They were already beginning to fade, just the fingertips, like dust being carried off by an invisible breeze. "You wrote my name," Julian said. "You knew." "I did not write your name," the librarian replied. "You did, the moment you became curious, the moment you asked when instead of why." He opened the ledger in front of him. Julian leaned forward and saw not just his name, but hundreds, thousands. Some he recognized. Some were yet to be born, all with dates beside them. all bound, and beneath it all a space. One final line, still unwritten. The librarian slid a black quill across the desk toward him. "It is time to sign." Julian stared at the quill. Its feather was not black, as he first thought, but a deep bruised purple, like something plucked not from a bird, but from a dream that died screaming. The tip glistened with ink that shimmered like oil under candlelight. Yet there was no candle, no flame, only the librarian's gaze, ancient, patient, hollow. Julian didn't move. A silence bloomed between them, thick and absolute. Not even his own heartbeat dared to echo in that place. He wanted to speak, to protest, to run, but something deeper than fear held him still. Not paralysis, something worse. Recognition. He had always been heading here. Each choice, each strange coincidence, every found book and sleepless night. It hadn't been a trap. It had been a path. And he had walked it willingly, step by step, like a thread pulled taut toward its knot. "I don't want to die," he said at last. The librarian did not blink. "You will not. You will simply be unread." Julian swallowed, his throat raw. "What happens if I don't sign?" The librarian's pale eyes tilted slightly upward. From the shadows above, there came a low rustling sound. Not wind, not rats. It was the flutter of pages, millions of them, as if the entire library were breathing in anticipation. Then, the librarian said something that chilled Julian to the bone. Then the pages turned themselves. Julian turned. Behind him, the shelves had changed. They now leaned in slightly, as if watching. And from one of the aisles, a figure began to emerge. A boy. Slender. Familiar. Julian gasped. It was him, but older. Hollowed. Mouth sewn shut with thread. Eyes bleeding ink. The thing wore his face like a borrowed mask and dragged behind it a trail of unfinished books, each with pages torn and screaming. The librarian did not raise his voice, but his words thundered in Julian's skull. A life unsigned becomes a story stolen, and a stolen story must be hunted. The figure was close now, breathing shallow, shaking, desperate. Its fingers trembled toward the quill. Julian backed away. The older version snarled, soundless, reaching for the ledger. Its hands passed through the pages, but left behind ash wherever they touched. The books on the shelves began to groan, spines creaking, words melting off their pages. All around him, the library was coming undone. "Choose," said the librarian. "Write the end, or live unwritten." Julian looked down at the quill again. His hands were fading, bones ghosting beneath translucent skin. The book in his other hand pulsed like a second heart, and the shadow version of himself was still reaching, closer, closer, mouth tearing thread by thread, ready to scream. Julian's vision blurred. The lights above flickered as if underwater, and the library floor began to tilt, just slightly, but enough to make every step feel uncertain, as if the building itself had lost patience with balance. His double, his shadow self, was no longer merely reaching. It was pleading. Its hands trembled in slow, unnatural spasms, trying to grasp the quill, the ledger hem. Muffled gasps pushed from behind its torn threads, as if it were suffocating beneath the weight of all the words it never got to say. Julian turned back to the librarian. "What happens if he signs instead?" Julian asked, voice brittle. The librarian's pale face remained still. Only his gloved fingers moved, drumming once against the surface of the desk, creating a sound like a bone striking glass. "He is your echo," the librarian murmured. "Echoes may scream, but they cannot author." The double let out a dry, rattling cry. "Then why is he here?" Julian demanded. "Why does he look like me?" "Because he is you, in the moment you turn away." Julian froze. Behind him, the doppelganger clawed closer, fingertips brushing the edge of the ledger. The parchment began to curl and hiss. Words on the page warped, bleeding backward into themselves. The name at the top, Julian Marrow, blurred into indecipherable symbols. The entire library groaned again. "Stop it," Julian whispered. "Make him stop." "I cannot," the librarian said gently. "Only you may fix the record." Julian stared again at the quill. It no longer looked like a pen. It looked like a blade. The echo screamed. Books began to fall from the shelves, thudding, cracking, spilling open with gaping mouths of text. Some burst into flame. Others wept ink like black tears across the floor. One book flapped like a dying bird, its pages coughing smoke. Somewhere above, a bell began to toll. Not the sound of a clock striking the hour, but a slow, massive chime, like a tomb being sealed. Julian's body was unraveling. One fingertip faded into dust. He looked down and saw the veins in his wrist glowing faintly, as if his blood had turned into something ancient, something remembered by the paper that surrounded him. And then, just as the shadow Julian lunged, a voice, not the librarian's, not his own, a voice from inside the shelves, deep and raw, like a child whispering from the bottom of a grave. Write, or we will. Julian snatched the quill. It burned. The shadow stopped, freezing mid-motion, mouth gaping in a frozen howl. Julian hovered the tip over the final line. It trembled. The ink seemed to wait, but he didn't write his name. Instead, he wrote one word, a word he did not recognize, but that came unbidden, pulsing through his wrist like a command from the library itself. The moment he finished the final stroke, the ink sizzled, the ledger snapped shut, and the lights went out. Darkness swallowed everything. There was no crash, no scream, no closing door, just a sudden, absolute absence of light, like the library had been inhaled by the void. Julian stood in it, or floated. He could no longer tell. His body no longer felt tethered to anything solid. There was no floor beneath his feet, but he had not fallen. Silence returned, not empty, but expectant. He still held the quill, or something like it. It now felt heavier, wet, alive. The word he had written burned behind his eyes, not in memory, but as sensation. He couldn't recall the letters, but he could feel their echo, carved somewhere into him, pulsing in his ribs like a second heart. Then faintly he heard something, rustling, like paper fluttering in a far-off wind. Then came footsteps, soft, slow, deliberate. The light returned, but not fully. A pale, greenish glow began to rise from beneath him, as if the very floor had turned into translucent parchment lit from below. Julian now stood at the center of a massive circular chamber, new, not the one before. Towering shelves spiraled upward into endless dark, but this place was colder, quieter, and he was no longer alone. All around the outer edge of the chamber stood tall, thin figures. They wore robes of ink-black linen. Their faces were wrapped in scrolls, bound with wire. Each figure clutched a book to their chest, some dripping, others smoldering, a few bleeding quietly onto the stone. Their heads turned toward him, slowly, one by one, with the sound of stretching leather. Then, from above, a voice echoed, not the librarian's, not the whisper from the shelves, but a third voice. It sounded split, like several voices speaking through one mouth. You have interfered with the order. Julian swallowed. I just wrote a word, he said. I didn't know what it meant. You were not meant to write, the voice hissed. You were meant to obey. Your story was sealed. Your page, final. But you opened something. Julian looked down. The book he had brought, the one that bore his name, was still there, but its cover had changed. The leather pulsed like bruised skin. New letters glowed on the surface, etched in silver fire. They read, Amendment. The figures around him began to murmur, low and wrong, like wind curling through the throat of a corpse. The voice returned. One who rewrites must be read. One who reads must be recorded. You are neither. You are both. Julian stepped back. I don't understand. From the shadows ahead, a new shape emerged, a small podium. Upon it sat a blank book, and beside it a mirror. But the mirror was not clean. It rippled with ink. As Julian drew closer, he saw faces in it, faces trapped behind the surface, pressing against it from the inside. His own face stared back at him too, but it was fractured, smiling, crying, screaming. Is this me? He whispered. The voice returned, now closer, as if breathing against his ear. It is every you that could have been, should have been, will be, unless you write again. The mirror began to crack. The figures around the circle lifted their books and began to open them, some violently, some reverently. Pages turned on their own, faster, faster, until the sound became deafening. Ink began to rise from the ground in tendrils, curling around Julian's legs, his hands, his neck. And then, just before the mirror shattered, he saw something behind his reflection. Not a shadow, not a monster. Another pen. Waiting. Julian couldn't move, not entirely. The ink had coiled around his limbs like vines, wet and whispering. It pulsed with language he couldn't read, but somehow felt. Every drop was a word. Every tendril, a sentence tightening. The mirror cracked again, splintering silently. On the pedestal, the second pen, blacker than night, hovered just above the blank book, as if suspended by gravity's opposite. Its tip trembled, dripping something darker than ink. Julian stared at the reflection. His other self, inside the glass, was still smiling. Not cruelly, not kindly, just knowingly, like it had already read the next chapter. You said I had a choice, Julian whispered to the air, to the void, to whatever governed this place. The surrounding figures did not speak, but their heads tilted in unison. The books in their hands began to bleed more openly, droplets of ink hitting the floor and sizzling, burning perfect letters into the stone. The voice returned, no longer layered, but sharp, single, infinite. Every writer must choose what they lose. Julian's eye snapped to the blank book. Its cover was no longer empty. It now bore a title. The Book of Unbecoming. He felt something slip behind his eyes. Memories. Names. Faces. They began unraveling softly, like threads pulled from cloth. He gasped. He couldn't remember the name of the girl who sat next to him in history class. His dog's bark faded from memory. The smell of his home, the color of his bike, gone smudged, like pages blurred by rain. The pen moved closer. Take it. That wasn't the voice from before. That was his voice, from the mirror. The reflection raised its hand, mirroring Julian's motion. The smile widened. Julian pressed the pen to the page and began to write. Not his name, but a story. One where he never entered the library, where no books whispered, no mirror cracked. With each word, the ink tendrils recoiled. The chanting stopped, but the mirror shattered. From within, echoes of himself spilled out, hungry, half-formed. He kept writing, faster, sealing them into the pages, one by one. When the final period was drawn, the book snapped shut. He stood alone. The library was gone. Only a single book remained in his hands, bound in silence. No title, no author. Only a blank first page, waiting. Why? Julian whispered. The reflection's mouth didn't move, but its answer echoed anyway. Because the librarian didn't write this one. You did. Julian's mind reeled. Suddenly, pieces locked together. The strange books that appeared in his locker, the echo of his double, the librarian's refusal to stop it. They weren't pushing him toward an end. They were waiting to see which ending he would steal. He reached for the hovering pen. It dropped into his fingers, like it had been waiting centuries. Cold, sharp, the kind of weight a secret carries. The ink slithered up his arm immediately, curling around his veins. Not pain. Something worse. Truth. It felt like writing him back into himself. He opened the Book of Unbecoming. Inside, there was only one sentence. To become, you must undo. And below that, a single, blinking line, like a cursor waiting for the first letter. The mirror flickered. The other Julians behind the glass stepped closer. Some sobbing, some grinning. One of them had no eyes. Behind him, the faceless scribes began to chant softly, in a tongue made of fragments and sighs. Write the self or lose the soul. Write the self or lose the soul. Julian gripped the pen tighter. The words built in his chest. Not just a sentence, a rewrite. But what he didn't know was this. Every time you write who you are, you erase who you were. And the mirror was beginning to open.